For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups who have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. The Rewilding podcast is made possible by donations from patrons. If you enjoy this podcast, please become a monthly supporter at patreon.com/PeterMichaelBauer. Lisa Wells is the author of Believers, Making a Life at the End of the World, The Fix, and winner of the Iowa Poetry Prize. Her essays have been published by The New York Times, Harper's Magazine, Granta, The Believer, N+1, and others. She lives in Seattle and writes a column for Orion Magazine called Abundant Noise. She's also one of my closest and oldest friends. I still remember the first time I saw Lisa. As a child, I was always called oversensitive. No one seemed to care about life and living things as much as I did. Eventually, I realized that in order to fit in, I would have to bury my feelings. Middle school destroyed and broke my spirit. They were the worst years of my life, as my insecurities inflated and I conditioned myself to hide who I really was. In hopes of alleviating the suicidal depression that this caused, I transferred to an alternative arts high school on the fringes of Portland. It was the first day of my sophomore year. I knew next to no one at the school. I had arrived early to class and was sitting alone watching the clock tick and quietly waiting for school to start. Suddenly the door burst open and in stomped a young punk girl with jet black hair and glowing green eyes, which later I learned were contacts. She slammed her bag on the desk with a look of indignation on her face, then spun around and marched right back out of the classroom, no doubt returning to some drama unfolding in the hallway. I knew in that instant that we would be lifelong friends. Lisa's gravitational presence of taking no shit, of being uncompromisingly herself and demanding that other people give a shit too, shook awake the parts of me that I had put to sleep. Her overt passion gave me permission to be myself, free to care about the world again. Through our 25 years of friendship, though we have both grown and transformed in many ways, she always has a way of helping me to find myself, to remember who I am and what I'm here to do. In her latest book, Believers, she sought out many different people, all seeking to find a way to live sustainably in the world, as we sit on the precipice of a collapsing civilization. In this conversation, we chat about the book, some of the subjects, including myself, the writing process, the role of storytellers as culture building, and much more. Well, thank you, Lisa, for coming on the Rewilding podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Just before we get into it, I do have to say that I am actually nervous to have you on the show, mostly because I feel like we're both good at like code switching in this particular way, where when we're talking to an audience, like each of us has our own way of talking. But I don't think we've ever I don't think either one of our like public talking personas have communicated together in this kind of way.
Not in a long time. I think probably the closest experience in history was that period where we were teaching together, outdoor ed.
Yeah, totally.
Because it is a kind of persona that you put on when you're working with kids.
Absolutely.
But obviously, it's a different flavor of persona.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's awesome.
I feel a little nervous too, because I definitely have a I have developed over the last 6 months a book specific mask that I put on for these events. So
Totally. You mean that's specific to the book that you wrote, The
yeah, I mean,
Believers,
it's
or is it?
impossible. I would love to say that every question inspires a novel answer, but I learned early on that actually doesn't go very well. It's not that pleasurable for the people listening to hear me fumble like that. So it's not like I have a script memorized, but I sort of have I mean, like
Totally.
you develop talking
Yes.
points. It's inevitable.
Yes.
So,
Totally.
but because it's you, I think we'll probably get into things that I've never talked about before, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about you mentioning us teaching together, and I'm like, oh yeah, we should totally talk about some of that stuff because we haven't talked about that in a really long time. Um,
Well, we
so
have
yeah,
20 and some odd years to go,
yeah,
25
right,
years
yeah,
of friendship to
exactly,
go on. So,
yeah, yeah. So I guess the first thing I'd like you to do is just describe the book Believers to the audience because I know a lot of people I know have already read it, but I know a lot of people haven't yet.
yeah, that's really cool. It's cool that a lot of people have read it. I don't know that a lot of people that I know have read it. uh, but your friends and community are probably the targeted audience
Totally.
more than like
Yeah.
the freaky poets I have been around in the
Right.
last couple
Yeah.
decades. Not that your people aren't poets too, I'm sure they are. Some of them. So, okay, my name's Lisa Wells. I'm a poet and a nonfiction writer and the author of a few books. But my most recent book, Believers, Making a Life at the End of the World, was out this July from Farrar, Straus and Giroux and features the podcast host, Peter Bauer.
It's true.
Pretty heavily. You're sort of my,
It's true.
walking companion in Dante's Inferno, my resident expert. So the book, the publisher's description, I think, does a decent job of conveying the map, if not the territory. And we can get into the territory and will, I expect. But the map is, so one origin story is that you and I read these books that some would say radicalized us. I don't think that was our experience of it at the time, but nevertheless, we decided that civilization was, going to collapse imminently. And we wanted to both try to rescue what remained of the natural world and prepare ourselves for this collapse scenario by learning to survive in the woods. And for a variety of reasons that are discussed in the book, the idealism that was the catalyst of that life decision for me, and I know your story is different, our paths sort of diverge after this, but a lot of that idealism played out, and a lot of the projections were eroded, and I couldn't find my footing in a world without the mythology that we had
Totally.
adopted. And so I turned away from the question, essentially because of burnout. And I think probably a lot of people who listen to this podcast know what I mean. It can be tough to find sustainable ways to engage with the reality of,
Totally.
well, frankly, fucking reality.
Right.
So I turned toward writing. And then, the idea was, what if now that I'm 30, so I've been sort of, I've had a almost decade long break. What if I turn back to those initial questions and, not only with the stability and maturity of adulthood and, sort of like hard-won psychological health, but also, as a writer with this new skill set and way of assimilating information. But also the landscape had changed significantly. You kind of kept your finger on the pulse, but I wondered, what more can I learn? Maybe this intractable problem actually does have solutions. And it turns out it does. And I did encounter a lot of new information through the book. So I go and talk to a bunch of different people who are not just sort of living more sustainable lives in the parlance of the dominant culture, but who have envisioned radically different cosmologies, who are telling very different stories about how people relate to their ecosystems and essentially what their ecological niche is. That is the nutshell of it.
Yeah.
The huge nutshell. That was a lengthy
that's
nutshell.
awesome. No, that's so awesome. Yeah, it's been cool. I mean, I remember, gosh, I don't even remember what year it was when we went to go see Phoenicia that time.
2014. It was
2014. Yeah.
April of
So,
2014.
I mean, essentially you were working on this for over like maybe 10 years or something. I
Six
mean,
years.
6 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think of. I have like one of the things that popped into my head where you're saying that is like, abandoning the sort of mythology that we had. I mean, did you like develop a new one to replace it? You know what I mean? Like in the process of making this book, do you feel like you have um like a different narrative, or is it a combination of things? Like how have you built like a different narrative based on that experience?
Yeah. So that's the best framing of a question that I get pretty frequently. And I'll give you the other ways that people frame it and then tell you my dilemma about answering this question. So people typically ask, how were you changed by writing the book? And how have you changed your life?
Yeah.
So it's not just how were you changed, but what are you doing that's
Right.
different?
Sure.
And it makes sense to me why people ask that, of course. But I don't want to be difficult. I think, yes, my worldview has radically shifted through the writing of the book because in essence, I think it's a work of philosophy more than it
Mm-hmm.
is anything else. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's immersive journalism, but
Totally.
mainly it's taking up these ideas and stories. That's the work of it. It's not a how-to manual. It's not easily bulleted. It's not like, here's what we learned from this book. Here are 10 things you can do to
Right,
fight climate
exactly.
change.
Yeah.
It's really like, how do we unstitch this invisible to us, mm, the warp and weft basically of the
Mm-hmm.
culture most of us have inherited.
Totally.
And what do we find when we pull that apart, and what are new narratives that we might sew in place? So that definitely happened in the writing of the book. But in terms of how has my life changed, or what, I guess that's an open question for me. And recently I heard someone say, um, books, when people write books, they don't change the world, but they can inspire people to change the world.
Totally.
And that has always felt like a cop out to me when other people have said it. But then when I reflect on the hell that I went through to produce this work over the course of 7 years, I thought, actually this is real. Like, this, for better or for worse, happens to be my niche. Like, this is the
Mm-hmm.
way that I know how to contribute. Um, and it took some years off my life,
Yeah.
frankly. you know um
Yeah.
does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean it also makes me think of something else, which is, I feel like I have pushback against this idea that we diverged. I feel like there's a part of me that's like, nah, like like
Yeah.
I get angry or like defensive or something. I feel myself feeling that way because I think in part, um, you know, and this is also because I'm just looking back at some of the stuff that we did when we were in our early 20s, like when I created Myth Media, I'm like reading back over some of that stuff, and it's like we were so much about being storytellers. That's
Yeah.
what we were about for a long time, and I feel like there was always this sort of feeling for both of us, even when I became like a blogger, people were constantly saying that I was just a talker and not a walker or something, you know what I mean?
Mm,
As if the storytelling aspect of culture isn't doing something, you know what I mean?
right.
Um, so I feel like that kind of relates to this idea
Yeah.
where, your
Well, let me
role is a storyteller. I mean, right? Isn't that, and that's what you do. You tell stories.
yeah.
So,
Well, let me clarify. As long as we're getting real. So I don't think our paths diverge that much. I think, probably I'm just drinking my own Kool-Aid to some extent, because I've had to learn how to succinctly describe this. In fact,
hmm
our lived experience does not match the neat, story we tell
Totally.
about it.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
of course I came back and forth, and you were always like updating me on the things that you were learning. So it's not like I was completely divorced from those conversations. I mean, I've always thought of you as a culture maker, um, and a storyteller. So I don't think we're that different. I also think of myself as a translator, as I think
Mm,
you do
mm,
too. Like,
hmm
you're translating to a lay audience or to an interested lay audience. I'm translating to people who don't know they're interested, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
So I don't imagine that the stuff that's in Believers is not going to be like probably earth shattering to the people who come to the Rewild forum, you know, like these are concepts that are alive and well in your milieu. But I think when you're swimming in those waters, it's easy to forget that the vast majority of the
Totally.
planet has absolutely no familiarity with any of this stuff, you
I
know?
know. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah, I don't think in that way we've diverged all that much.
totally.
I just think my obsessions went completely toward learning how to write,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
which I continue to find incredibly challenging several books later. Like doing it well is very hard, you know?
Yes. Well, you were very, very talented at it, so it's hard to tell that you're having a hard time.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, you should talk to the person I
Yeah.
live with. They'll tell you all about it. But you know, you have really kept up in these conversations and
Hmm.
continued to interrogate your own ideas and grow. And you've been growing in public in this way, which is well, how's that been for you?
Well, you mean like over the last decade, or I mean, I stepped out of that for a while, once the Urban Scout project was very much in the public's eye, and then to create Rewild Portland, I very much like stepped away from that for 5 or 6 years, and then came back to it in sort of 2015 because of the because of the word rewilding becoming popular in these different ways, and me be the angry urban scout part of me having to like come back, I don't know, it's like a butterfly metaphor or something, like to come back into the world changed, not as urban scout but as rebranded Peter Michael Bauer or something. um and yeah, I think it's uh, just speaking to different audiences, and uh I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to be in the public eye. It's hard to use social media, but I actually feel like I get off on it in like a fucked up kind of way.
Do tell.
Well, like I'm in the process of writing a book proposal for a publishing company, and so for my sample chapter, I'm like writing about domestication, and in the process, like make memes about domestication that are like just fucking over the top and absurd, and then I'll post them on social media to like gauge the response to
Yeah.
see like how I should actually write about it, like in the book,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
That's
not like
interesting.
some inflammatory meme or something that I post to like get the reaction. But in that whole like emotional moment of like I'm I post this horrible meme, or not horrible, but just like provocative,
Inflammatory.
instigatory.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And then I go through this like emotional roller coaster while there's responses coming in about it, right? Where I'm like
Mhm.
angry and upset, or like all these different things, and then I like synthesize all of it, and then I like da da da. Then I'm just like writing it like
Yeah. Yeah.
calmly and
Yeah.
casually about. Anyway, I
Well,
don't know
it's
where that.
interesting that I mean, I think sort of the old academic tradition of getting people together on these panels to really not stroke each other's egos, but to argue with one another's ideas,
Right.
um, you know, not as a way of sort of, I feel like often we orient toward criticism, especially on social media platforms, but it's also just the zeitgeist right now. Um, like my criticism is going to be leveled in order to cleanse you of some toxic idea or something,
Right. Totally.
rather than
Yeah.
viewing it as, which I don't think I'd ever thought of social media in this way until you just said this, as a sort of surrogate writer's room, like a place where
Totally.
you can solicit reactions, because every time we're writing, particularly argumentation, we're responding to what we anticipate the reader is going to ask or reject, or what their biases are that need to be unpacked so that they can come to the next level with you. Um, so that's interesting. I mean, I fucking hate social media, but
Yeah.
I do think it has a purpose in these
Yeah.
ways. So um,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, I think we experienced that a little, like prior to what is now considered social media. There was like that Ishmael forum where, it was the same kind of thing where
Yeah.
I had like two different profiles, an anonymous one where I could fuck with people and say
Yeah.
horrible things and see what their responses were, and then like a normal one that was, still inflammatory, but not as much as my my fake profiles, which
Well,
I
you
know
were an
people.
early adopter. I mean, I think back to your internet life even as a kid.
True, it's
You
true.
engaged with these kinds of technologies very
Yeah,
early, which is funny
yeah,
for a person who, you know, talks about ancestral skills. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, I'm curious how one of the things I was surprised about in reading your book was how much like Christianity. I know this is like another thing other people have said, but like how much
No, it's okay.
Christianity comes up,
Yeah.
and it's actually like totally made me want to go down that rabbit hole. Like it's definitely a thing that inspired me to like learn more about that. And I'm curious if that's something that you've like explored further after,
Mm,
the book.
yeah. I mean, I got plenty of it in the book. So I was ready to be done.
Yeah.
Uh, my editor was uncertain about that choice
Mm,
for obvious reasons, I think. Like, one, it can feel like it's too much. I mean, there is a lot of that in the book. And also, people have a real understandable aversion. I mean, if you're not writing to Christians, which is a big market, but I wasn't. I was writing to, non-believers and probably people who have some, measure of hostility toward
right.
Christianity, understandably. And I'm not a believer, so I'll just say that I'm not a Christian. But the more I read about these anti-empire watershed disciples, um, the more I felt like it was really important to dig into, in part because it's still like in the groundwater. Catholicism too, Christianity. In this country, we sort of absorbed a lot of its metaphors. I mean, at least it's metaphor family. Even I wasn't raised Christian at
Totally.
all, and I absorbed
Totally.
a lot of those metaphors, a lot of those ways of sort of orienting to morality, or even the notion of good and evil, right? And when we were kids and we were reading Tom Brown and Daniel Quinn, we really sort of picked up this latent Christian
Totally.
material and oriented toward the world in terms of like demons and
Right.
mindless
Exactly.
gray masses and all of these really polarizing ways of
Yeah.
thinking about complex organisms. So it seemed important to look at that because a, it's as much the fabric. I mean, it worked in lockstep with empire. So if you want to dismantle the empire, like, interrogate its hidden assumptions, you have to look at Christianity too. But also this idea that I got from them about the Christ figure as the sort of the Pied Piper who leads you out of empire, and um, and then in the earlier iteration in Exodus, Moses leading the
Totally.
Israelites out of
Yeah.
Egypt. So, this idea that in fact this religions came out of empire in reaction to and as a form of rejecting empire, and it being a framework, an alternate framework that gives people the courage and energy to push off the immense gravity of all they've known. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like, what could be more apropos to our moment? Um, because if you come from an intact culture, you don't need to fight what you've learned. You don't need to fight your cultural inheritance. You don't need to, you're going to have to fight to preserve it and to protect it. But for those of us who were born into the dominant culture and are living, breathing, you know, we're being ventriloquized by it all the time, me, you, everybody. Uh, it's interesting to look at traditions that sort of deal with that problem. So in the Christian tradition, at least as these folks who are in my book tell it, there were these kind of technologies that were adopted in order to fight that gravity. So there's like a cluster of behaviors that they call Sabbath economics, and it goes way beyond just observing the Sabbath day, but like building in these periods of rest where you're resting the land, you're resting your beasts of burden, you're forgiving debts, you're flattening hierarchies, and that just being like woven into the cultural fabric.
Totally. Yeah.
And you're the one who
Yeah.
gave me this term, culturally imposed limits to growth.
Oh,
uh
did I?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, so still not not going to go to church anytime soon, but I will say that I
Yeah.
met some very incredible people who I think are doing really great work, and with the added benefit that because they believe in this spirit of forgiveness and goodness, they um, tend to have more light about them.
Yeah.
It's not like there's not so much sort of heavy, angry darkness.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think too, well, in reading it, I've really rejected that stuff for a long time, especially even with like my friends who are into like pagan stuff or like neo-pagan stuff of Europe. I'm basically like, fuck anything after the Iron Age or fuck anything after the Neolithic, none of it's animist or indigenous, blah, blah, blah. I think I'm wrong. First of all, I think I'm wrong. I think there's lots. I think, wildness is always emerging
Yeah.
out of us because we're wild, and domestication is this imposition on us. And so um, it's a force that has to be constantly there, right? And so all these, I think a lot of the religions and culture that comes out of civilization is actually, especially revolutionary stuff in its moment, is like you're saying, essentially walking away from empire, or leading people out of empire, or attempting to, and then it just somehow gets like recapitulated back into the system. And I love,
Right.
like, I remember when we saw, I just think about this all the time. For whatever reason, I use the metaphor of Al Gore and that movie, An Inconvenient Truth, because I remember we went and saw it somewhere. I remember it was like some hot summer night in Portland, and we were like riding bikes afterwards in the dark, and I remember just like fucking ranting about it for hours. And it was just that thing of like, here's a problem, climate change. We're like, yes, awesome. And the solution is to like buy light bulbs, right? It's like this weird thing where the problem is illuminated, but then you're just roped back into the same fucking system that created the problem,
Yeah,
right? And
it's
I
like
just
the
think
end
about that.
of Princess and Mononoke.
Yeah, right. We're gonna build a better Iron Town. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Wait, but what made you think of Al Gore?
Oh well, just the idea of religion having, let's say that there was a person that was leading people away from empire, but then the story is embraced by those in power, twisted, and
Yeah.
then ropes people right back into the system, right? So
Right.
it's like a exit, but it's a revolving door. So you think you're going out the exit, but then you just end up right back inside,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah. So anyway, it got me to um, in terms of the way you framed it and interviewed Todd, and that's his name, right? Todd.
Todd Winward.
Yeah. Um, I just now I'm like very curious about looking into the potential sort of like animistic naturalist um, aspects that did and have emerged from these religions through individuals rather than the state or like the institution of the church, but rather like I don't know, like Christian mystics. What's that all about?
Yeah.
That's like my mood now.
The Desert Fathers.
Yeah,
Sure.
what's going on with that? I'm interested in that all of a sudden.
Yeah, and
Not
also
because I'm going to become
acknowledging,
Christian, but just because I
yeah.
want to know how these different stories have potentially held these nuggets of truth or these nuggets of wildness through time, how and when they emerge from time to time. Was there anything in the book that you had to cut out that you were really annoyed with, like any people, or like were all of the subjects that you ended up wanting to be in the book, or were there people that you had to kind of like, eh?
I cut two people from the book. One person didn't decided they didn't want to be in it, for a variety of reasons, which I won't, in
Sure,
out of respect for their
sure.
anonymity, I won't describe. Um, and then another person, I needed to trim the fat somewhere. And so I did this radical thing. I mean, radical for people who write like books like mine, in that I sent pages to everyone. As you know, I sent you
Totally.
your
Yeah.
pages, and I allowed them to
Yeah.
respond to it.
Yeah.
I didn't make all the changes everybody asked for, but I did hear everyone out. And also it's helpful because it's actually very difficult to, as we see all the time in the press, to get all the facts right.
Oh yeah.
Just even though I record audio for all my interviews,
Totally.
still things get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a time-saving device if I have my subjects read the pages and correct anything that needs to be corrected. And sometimes they misstate things in the interview, and then they go back and change it.
Totally.
But you're always rolling the dice, because it's hard to, as you know, and I've experienced this as well, it's hard to see yourself represented in print. Yeah. Because you're not a whole person that's captured in black and white, inevitably it's going to feel false to some extent, or it's going to only be part of the story or whatever. So anyway, people react very differently, and I'm always surprised by how people react, because frequently it's the person I think is going to be most upset who's the most thrilled, and then somebody who I think I'm doing a puff piece on, like in fact, one of these profiles, I wasn't sure if it was worthy of being in the book, frankly, because it was just uncomplicated. It was just, this person's great, and that's a person who wanted to be cut out. So you just never know. Anyway, so another person had been crabby in their response, and I was like, great, I'm just going to cut you out completely, because I need to cut somebody, and
right.
So now it's
yeah.
And I sort of take it on faith that the right thing happens. Yeah. It's such a collaborative process writing a book, though most of the labor of it is done in a room alone.
Totally.
Because you're bringing in a book like this, a nonfiction book like this, you're bringing in all of these people's life stories and all of these interviews with the people surrounding them, and you're bringing in other texts, and you have an editor and a fact checker, and it just, it's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah. Did you ever get a chance to talk to Phoenicia about it?
So Phoenicia read the Believer article that was the first iteration of the chapter that wound up in the book.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, I mean, I'm sure she had all kinds of colorful things to say about it. But
sure.
But when I asked her, I told her I was going to do an update in the book, and I asked her if she took issue with anything in the article and if there's anything she wanted changed, and she said no. But she was good like that. She didn't.
Totally.
She didn't give a shit, like.
Oh, she didn't.
Like, I would sort of try to get. I mean, I would touch base with her about a lot of sensitive aspects of her life, and she was like, did not give a shit. Yeah. She was like, write whatever you want. It'll show me who you are. I mean, that was what she told me. So if you publish something like defamatory, then I know who you are. But when we did our final interview, the last time I spoke to her, which is the end of that chapter, she knew that this was the update for the book, and who knows how much she sensed about her own imminent demise at that time. And, those final pages are some of my favorite in the book, even though I'm on the receiving end of her venom. I think she speaks with such epic, profound, cutting eloquence in those final pages. I'm really, really grateful that we talked that day.
Yeah. Do you still have that recording?
Oh yeah. I know. I think one day maybe I'll do something with all this stuff, because I have recordings of everyone. Yeah,
it'd be interesting to I wonder if somebody's going to do a whole thing on her, just her singularly, at some point. I hope
so.
It'll be interesting.
I mean, they were making that documentary about her for years. I don't know.
So there's definitely footage and stuff, and she made lots of little videos and things.
And there was a woman in England, I believe her name is Joanna Pocock.
Hmm.
Yeah, have you read
Yeah.
that book?
I haven't read the book yet, but when she was working on it, she actually came to Portland and took one of my basket weaving classes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Are you in the book?
I think I was originally supposed to be, and then I don't think I ended up in it.
Oh,
I
okay.
haven't read
I
it.
haven't read it either. I need to get my hands on it, but
Yeah.
since my book has come out, people have been talking to me about it,
Mm, mm,
you know.
hmm.
Um, and I think that might have focused pretty heavily on Phoenicia.
I think so. Yeah, I think there's a lot about her in it, but I don't know either. I never read it. Yeah. What do you I've got my list of questions now, and
Yeah, yeah.
there's a lull. I'm drifting back to my list of
I'm gonna have
questions.
questions for you too, I'm
Oh,
sure.
that's my
But
last question is what questions do you have for me? But I'm not there yet. So,
oh, okay.
um, here's a question. I don't know if you got this one yet. So you're a mom now.
Yeah.
Has that, I don't know if this is a lame sort of softball question or not, but I feel like I'm curious if there's anything that like perspective wise that you would write differently, or because you started the book when you had Jude essentially after it was all in process to be published or printed, correct?
Yeah, the afterword, I'm pregnant. That was the last thing I wrote.
Right.
So
Yeah. So now that you're a mom, like, has that, like, is that affecting your future works? Would you have written Believers differently, or, what? I don't know.
well, I can tell you practically, I wouldn't have written it because I have like many pieces I'd love to do, but I can't get away in the way that I used to. Those pieces were pretty immersive where I'm
Mm,
spending, multiple
totally.
days at a time.
Right.
And I hope, eventually I'll be able to return to that way of working, but
Hmm.
I'm not really sure how. And obviously COVID changes things too.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Combination of factors. Yeah.
I think I feel like he came into my life at the precise moment that I ceased to care about my own life,
Mm,
um, and really accelerated that process.
mm,
So, when we were kids, part of the motivation to make the moves that we did was I wanted to live. I was
right.
scared,
Yeah.
I was really
Totally.
afraid of, I wasn't actually that afraid of climate change. I mean, it's funny how much things
I
change
know.
in
I
20
know.
years. I was
Yeah,
like,
totally. We didn't
I
even talk
imagined a
about
lot
it
of other
really.
things happening before that,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Um, Similarly, I didn't think we would be seeing such intense weather changes so
Mm,
quickly.
hmm. Totally.
It feels like just in the
Yeah.
last couple of years,
Oh
it's
yeah.
really,
Oh yeah.
things have been kicked up a notch.
Hmm.
But I think you come to terms with, I mean, one would hope. I certainly made some effort in my life to come to terms with my own mortality because, well, it's the only guarantee.
Right.
So, uh, it's not like a depressive thing. I just think you get to a point where your individual survival means less.
Yeah.
And and then he was born. And now I have a renewed sense of fear, frankly, and
Shit.
um
Yeah.
and also it means that a lot of these abstract ideas are embodied in a different way. So
Mm,
I'm much more for better and for worse. So on the worse end, I'm much more sort of I'm collapsing the distance um, when I'm doing things like turning on or off the lights, and yes, we all know taking shorter showers will not save the planet and all that. There are some people that are disproportionately responsible, blah blah blah. Setting that aside, I'm just much more aware of my impact.
right.
And I think, oh well, I'm like shaving time off my son's life right now when I'm
Mm,
doing this thing, or when I'm
mm,
wasting this, or
mm,
I'm taking out his shitty diaper to the garbage, and I'm like,
mm.
cool, like I'm
Fuck.
soiling the planet with this plastic and shit,
Right.
so that my child can
Yeah.
whatever, have a clean butt. I think it's just a much more fraught, just daily life is much
Totally.
more
Yeah.
freighted with the
Yeah.
reality.
Hmm.
I'm sure all of the hippie moms are now going to judge me for having
You don't
cloth.
have cloth diapers? Oh my
Yeah. Well,
God.
I also have no social support, so there's a lot of ways in which I'm not
Yeah.
living a very
Well,
traditional lifestyle.
everybody has to make what is it called? Trade-offs. Yeah.
Yeah, deals with the devil.
Yeah.
But on the positive end of the spectrum, he's all right brain. So just spending time with him is bringing me back
Mm.
into physical reality
Mm.
in a way that I hadn't been inhabiting my
Mm.
body
Mm-hmm.
in the world for years. So such a left brain for so long. Just like
Totally.
living in books and on computer
Yeah.
screens and stuff.
Yeah.
And so, just even watching him interact with, he just loves mud and he likes to dig in our garbage can. And it's just like whatever the grossest thing is
Yeah.
what he's most
Yeah.
attracted to. I'm sure because he senses there's a taboo attached
Oh
to
yeah,
it.
probably. Yeah.
But if I can like stop myself from interrupting that, it's cool to kind of, it's almost like a mushroom trip or something, or you're like, the label falls away and you're just
Mm.
interacting with the
Mm-hmm.
phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And a lot of laughing too, just like the mushroom
Yes.
trip.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Um, what is this is what is no one asking you about the book that you feel like they should have asked you about the book?
Boy,
And has anybody asked you that question?
nobody's asked me that.
Yes.
Yeah.
First.
I've had somebody ask me what the reviewers got wrong, and of course,
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
well,
No,
I
no,
don't know.
no.
It's kryptonite, man. You don't touch that.
Oh, right.
Because
Okay.
the thing is, if you answer,
Yeah.
you sound petty.
True. That's
It's
true.
better just to
I'm
let it
more
go.
petty than you, so I would probably answer that.
I mean, I have privately shared the hilarious.
Yes. Yeah, sure. Privately is definitely a
the
different.
Gretel Ehrlich review in the Times where you were a training.
Urban Scouts.
No, you're a training performance artist.
Yeah, a team of urban scouts. Yeah, performance artists called urban scouts.
Those guys.
But by the way, hold on. That's where it's like life imitates art, imitates life. I'm like, fuck, that's fucking genius. I'm doing that next summer.
Yeah, she was doing us all.
Now that it's in print, I have to make it a reality.
Yeah. Oh, I hope you do.
We'll see.
I hope you do.
See.
But I think the thing that I always want to be asked about, of course, is the technical aspects of it, not the content. Like, because that was the hardest stuff for me to figure out. Like, how do you narrativize real life in a way? And I'll remind your audience, I'm a trained poet. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a fiction writer. So I never had any experience like constructing scenes and creating narrative tension and using dialogue, from actual conversations in life. So all of that was new to me. I mean, the amount that I didn't know when I started is astonishing, so just the construction of it, there are just scenes in that book that I feel really proud of how I was able to kind of handle the content. And then also some of the complications, like, when you return to a story again and again and again, it just gets deeper and deeper if you're willing to push back against your own assertions. So I think because I was with the Phoenicia essay for the longest, I think there are moments where it really becomes complex, especially the ethical quandaries of her.
Yeah.
That I feel proud of, because it's not black and white stuff, and it's hard to deal with that material with courage, I think. That said, the people I was writing about gave me so much material to work with, and also constructing your story was difficult because I was there for so much of it.
Totally.
And you take it for granted. It's almost like writing about yourself. Like, how do I make this interesting? How do I empty my cup and remember what it was like not to know any of this stuff, or not to have experienced it, So why don't you tell me what it was like to read about yourself in the book?
Well, I mean, just the whole thing in general. I think it's funny too, in a sort of like
different way where, I mean, like a lot of the experiences we shared together, uh, and so like, and I've talked to you about a lot of it, but it's totally different, like talking to you and hearing you tell me your opinion than like reading your thoughts, basically, right? Like, so it's in a sense, it was like, oh, this is cool because I'm actually like in Lisa's head. You know what I mean? Like, it was a different than just sort of having conversation. And so that was probably the most fun part of the book and unexpected was just feeling like getting to know you better in a way that I had never, we'd never, never would have got to know you before. Um, so yeah, I think that was the funnest thing for me, was just to be able to like be inside your head in this way that I'd never, you just as a friend couldn't
Hmm.
possibly be without like reading your writing, Yeah.
Wow, that's so cool. So what has it been like, I mean, for you personally, having, this one, you know, part of your life. It was kind of a big part of your life, but it certainly doesn't all encompass, it's not all encompassing. It's not who you are,
Sure. Yeah.
that
No.
urban scout saga. And that was a kind of a fraught time that I'm writing about in the book. So, I'm curious about what it was like to make yourself vulnerable in that way. Um, and then
Yeah, I mean,
also what people have said to you about it since they've read it.
well, lots of my friends have sent me messages like, oh, "I'm reading all your secrets," or like, "Oh, I didn't," I don't know, different things. And another friend was like, surprised at how I allowed myself to be so vulnerable, Um, and I thought that was interesting because I just, I mean, I'm like, I mean, I was writing about all this shit as it was happening. Like, I'm an open book. I'm the worst oversharer ever. Like my dad, oversharer, doesn't understand when to shut his mouth. And I've had this conversation with him forever, doesn't know what's appropriate to say, in the right context. And I definitely am my father's son. Um, and so, yeah, I overshare. I don't, and so I make myself vulnerable, I think, to a fault. And then, yeah, just dealing with that, yeah, like just especially feeling like with, cancel culture or whatever, like the shit of the calling the police, getting my car destroyed, all those things like that, it all kind of settled to the bottom of the tank or whatever, and then in sort of knowing that this book was coming out is going to like stir it back up again. But that's not to say that the same kinds of people who, again, your audience is definitely different than the people who were intentionally fucking with me when I was younger and instigating them to do so. um but still, like, just kind of having that uh in context made me want to specifically um, talk a little bit more about those things. Like one of the things that was brought up in the book was, this back when cancel culture wasn't a word, but deplatforming people you disagree with was something that's always been around in different shapes and forms. And so when I was supposed to go on my book tour in 2011, and this like anarchist info shop uh, canceled my stop there because they said that they heard I had called the police once or whatever, non-emergency line, to like tell them that I was being harassed and it was a stupid thing. And I wrote about how it was stupid after the fact and all these things. And I sent them emails and like, hey, I wrote about how that was dumb. Like, what if instead we, if this is a concern for you, what if we turned the whole event into a alternatives to calling the police, like symposium or whatever, like what if, I come through and we talk about rewilding and how, that can be, not calling the police. The alternatives to that are a form of rewilding. Like, what does that look like? And they were basically just like, no.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like hearing about that and then being like, man, that didn't happen. So, and having it kind of drudged back up in a sense, being like, man, maybe I never ended up like having a cool symposium on alternatives to calling the police. And now I'm like interested in doing that again, not just because of potential backlash from that story resurfacing in a sense, but because it's a really great idea.
Yeah.
And it was annoying that they said no. Like, how cool would that have been?
That would have been cool.
Um,
but I mean, it also kind of illuminates one of the problems of all human interaction, which is we're very rarely talking about what we claim to be talking about.
Yeah, totally.
Or we're talking about what we're talking about, but we're also talking about a whole lot of other things.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think what you say in the book, which was from an interview, probably 6 years ago, is they don't want the transformation. They just want to essentially like talk shit, like create a villain.
Yeah.
And this sort of this is what I'm interested now in writing about is all of the unconscious dynamics that are playing out interpersonally and in groups, and always have been, right? Like, and the different ways in which cultures and communities have brought awareness to these currents that control our lives and totally overdetermine how we relate to one another or don't, or fail to relate. Anyway, this seems like a perfect instance where it's like, okay, well, is it that we fear now that there will be some retribution for us if we host you?
Totally.
Is this sort of a convenient cover so that we can reassert our ethical purity? What purpose does it serve? Or maybe it was actually easier because we had something else we wanted to host that night, so we're just gonna
exactly.
save ourselves the trouble.
Totally.
It's interesting to me the idea of like just choosing to be as honest about what you're doing at any given time by saying or doing whatever. Right. In a time where it feels very high stakes because really probably just because of the speed and visibility of communication now.
Yeah. So are you working on another book specifically around that?
I was reading about cults, because
Nice.
because we were kind of in that cult, and then also just wanting to understand the way righteous ideas can be employed as devices to control and exploit people, and also just this like need to promote bonding via exclusion. You and I are going to bond by casting someone out.
Totally.
I mean, it's all very inchoate, but it feels like maybe the most important thing I could look at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What cults have you been looking at?
Well, I was reading this Robert J. Lifton, which his name has been all around lately, but writing about loading the language and sort of the tenets of totalitarianism and how people sort of exert mind control, basically. And I think the writing was from the early 60s, but it feels totally relevant to today. I mean, maybe even more so now.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can't claim to have been researching very deeply, but I did, like everybody else, like binge watch all these cult documentaries.
Totally. Yep.
Like The Vow was the one that probably reminded me the most of, Keith Raniere and that whole.
I haven't seen that one yet.
Oh my God, it's disturbing. But some of his moves really reminded me of the people that we were enthralled to as kids. Which I think you were more impervious to. I was much more ready to be kind of told I was bad. Like that's how the totalitarian from my childhood kind of tricked out later in life, where like if somebody tells me I'm bad, I'm like, ooh, really? How can I be good? Not so much anymore, but when we were young.
Yeah.
But one of the ways that he controls people is, you make some kind of observation and he twists it so that it's your shit. That's the shorthand,
Right.
And I feel like we got that a lot. Like if you had any kind of doubt or criticism, it was because you
totally
were, toxic or
Hmm.
had failed to become
Yeah.
sufficiently
Yeah.
pure or
Absolutely.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It, like,
Yeah.
protects the person in the top by,
Yeah.
yeah, just turning it around on. It makes me think
Well,
of, like, the whole concept of coyote mentoring is this idea of, like, lie to people.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't, like,
Yeah.
that's not really what mentoring is, right? But I mean, I think that was, like, such an intrinsic part of, like, being able to maintain this illusion of knowledge and power over other people, is to be like, well, I'm not going to give you the answers. You have to figure them out for yourself. I have all of the answers, but I'm not
Yeah.
going to give them to you, and there's no way you'll never know, because I'm just going to keep asking you questions when you ask me questions. Like, it's just so fucking annoying. And
Wow,
it's
it was
interesting,
annoying.
like, just
It was annoying, and it also
specifically.
it destroyed our. I mean, for me, that was the
Yeah.
reason why I didn't
Yeah, it
stick
fucking
with
killed
any of
it.
it.
It fucking
Yeah,
killed it.
killed the
And it's
dream.
fascinating too, especially, like, later on I learned about the cyber tracker evaluations. So, we were learning coyote mentoring. We were learning animal tracking through these methods of quote unquote coyote mentoring that came from, like, Tom Brown Jr. and John Young and stuff, where they don't tell you all the answers or whatever. And then I learned about, like, Bushman culture and tracking culture there. They never fucking hold anything back. Everybody's constantly sharing, so much that they cheat during tests with sign language. Like, they do tracker evaluations and they'll give each other the answers with sign language.
Yeah, so you're not
Like, there's just,
hoarding knowledge.
yeah, yeah. Because in
Yeah.
immediate return hunter gatherer societies, everything must be shared, even knowledge.
Yeah.
Whereas in this, I mean, it's not to say that, that on your own trial and error isn't a good thing, right? Like, there's definitely a level of, like, being able to learn to ask questions and learn particular things. But in it was weird because it was sort of like an authoritarian version of, like, something that probably was cool.
It was. I think you're exactly right. It
Yeah.
was taking something that was cool, like most of the things they did, and um, you know, probably largely unconsciously, except maybe in the case of one teacher.
Sure. Yeah.
Uh, infecting it with the same old hierarchical control and domination story.
Right.
Um, I think in order for that to work, it doesn't work when you have a rotating cast of pay to play students who are just showing up
Mm-hmm.
for a week. Like, you have to actually know someone
Mm-hmm.
and see
Totally.
them
Yeah.
and be attuned to what actually serves them in the moment,
Yeah.
um yeah, man, all the hazing. I mean, we're probably in the weeds. I can't believe that your listeners will even care about this, but I just it's too bad that there doesn't seem to have been any kind of awakening um, from those guys.
I know.
Like, I understand if that's what we experienced there and whatever, but there is certainly enough interrogation of these hierarchies, these racial and gender hierarchies, the cultural appropriation. I mean, there's so much
Totally.
in the cultural conversation right now around this stuff, and to just to see it them be like basically Teflon, and there's no
Yeah.
onboarding of
Yeah.
any of this stuff.
I mean, and I think I mean, it's like you said, there's different audiences that are into different aspects of it. There's millions and millions of people in this country alone. How many of those people give a shit? How many of those people even know any of the, like, larger contexts that we know? There's just not a lot, and, like, people can just apparently continue to get away with uh, certain things forever. And I think you're right when you say that it's more relevant now, because, I mean, think about what was happening to the economy in the 60s and 70s, tanking with different things that were going on. And I mean, it's similar that's happening now. I mean, I honestly feel like what we're going to see is more and more cult like groups. I mean, and we're already seeing things like, Proud Boys and Three Percenters and these sort of fascist cult brotherhood, whatever.
Yeah.
I think there's just going to be more of those, because people are looking for connection.
Yeah.
And it's like you said, they're connecting about how they can hate on somebody else, essentially.
Well, I think there's also I'm not a man, so I don't want to speak out of turn. I don't know what it's like to be socialized male and to experience misogyny in that way, or patriarchal violence in that way. But I've seen it from the outside, and it seems like there's really not much available in the way of like healthy narratives that people can inhabit that give them a sense of purpose and belonging and self-worth. And in absence of that, into that vacuum rushes easy explanations about how you've been fucked over.
Totally.
And I can't say that I don't want to pretend like I don't understand what it's like to live without a story,
Yeah.
So it's too bad. I would love to see more. I mean, maybe it's out there and I just haven't been introduced to it, but I would love to see more men, finding ways to connect in
There's
service.
definitely an undercurrent for sure. And it's
Really?
funny because, and I'm just now, again, it's kind of sort of like a Christianity thing for me. Like I just, the concept of masculinity, I've just never been interested in it. I've never felt like, I mean, I definitely have felt not masculine enough for whatever. I'm definitely like subjected to all of those things, but I just feel like my rejection of it was enough to not have to sort of interrogate any of that stuff. And I feel differently now, just with the rise of all these different groups and kind of trying to understand it. I've never felt particularly connected to the cultural constructs of masculinity, but I'm also not like queer. And so where do I sit with any of this? I don't know. It's sort of the same.
Aren't you though? I mean, one of the interesting things, I think generationally we're weird because I don't know what your ideas about this were. I think I didn't have any ideas about gender or sexuality or really anything outside of like you're gay or not.
Sure. Yeah.
But one of the interesting things for me about hearing like younger generations really have a lot of facility around gender fluidity and stuff is that I think I probably inherited this sort of Foucauldian idea that true liberation is not having to categorize or identify.
Totally.
Of
Yes.
course, most people aren't afforded that luxury. They need to
Right.
identify. It's a political
Totally.
choice.
Absolutely.
But I absorbed that, where I felt like,
Yeah.
I didn't want to have to choose.
Yeah.
You
No,
know?
I think you're spot on. I agree with that 100%. And then at the same time, it's like I think maybe that's why I'm equating it with this Christianity thing, because to me, I'm not Christian. I don't identify with it. So I don't research it. I don't care about it. I'm working on this other part of rewilding. But then in trying to figure out how to bring rewilding to or interface rewilding in different ways with different communities, in one of my classes, my Rewilding 101 class, I talk about there's a whole session on being culturally competent, or context competent, and understanding like multiple cultures and how to bridge them and to get rewilding connected to them, right? To sort of have this, a doorway into a different perspective. And so in that regard, if there's millions of people that are Christian, I want to learn a little bit about that so that I can, understand that there's a doorway and connect with people that are Christian who do identify that way, that are rewilding, right?
Right.
And the same, I think, is true of masculinity. I don't consider myself like masculine. I mean, I guess I do and I don't. I don't even, I just basically hate the word masculine and I hate the word feminine.
Yeah.
But I get, because I feel like a good balance of both, but I don't even hate the word balance in regards to those things. I just want to reject all of it.
Well, because it's not a linear spectrum. You know what I mean? Like the reason why you and I are having a hard time even having this conversation is because language fails.
Yeah.
Like there's no way to capture the mysteries of fucking existence.
Yeah, exactly.
What it is to be in a body and to be seen in these
Yeah.
different ways, and the fact that it changes moment to moment, day to day, year to year, whatever.
Totally. And
But when you're talking about building bridges, I think this is crucial. And I think it's much safer and easier to reject people that we um, disagree with, or if we feel they have dangerous ideas. Um, and certainly there are people for whom it's not realistic to interact with those types. But for those of us who can sort of sit with people who threaten us
Yeah,
um, long enough to until there's an opening. And sometimes there never will be, but in many cases,
totally.
I think there is.
Yeah,
That's that you have to think about impacts. So the impact of that um, probably far outweighs whatever impact you're going to have just denouncing someone.
right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in that regard, I'm curious about masculinity. So I've been kind of going down that rabbit hole a little bit as well, just in terms of how different groups of men are reshaping it or looking at it in different ways. Only out of curiosity of not for myself per se as an individual, but as a cultural curiosity, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I guess we got it all figured out.
Yeah, we're done. No. What questions do you have for me?
Well, how does it feel to sort of, you know, try to write again,
Hmm.
uh, from where you are now in life and, something new, something other than Rewild or Die, which I know was sort of a work in progress, a magnum opus, if you will. Yeah, what has that been like?
I think it was really hard to. So I've been telling people ever since I finished Rewild or Die in 2008, that I'm writing another book. I'm working on another book. So it's been, I don't know, what, 16 years almost. And for the last 6 years, I've been doing these Rewilding 101 classes where I'm orating. I'm essentially a lecturer slash discussion. I lead discussions and I lecture at people. Um, and I've sort of found my calling in that. I feel like it's different than writing. And so I haven't written. And I think it was, oh, my attention span is different. I can't sit down to, um, and I think about, there's a book called On Writing by, Stephen King.
Yeah, I've
I
read it.
love that book. It's so good. Yeah, I think maybe you were the one that recommended it, maybe. I don't know. I read it when I was like 19 or so. It was when we were living in that house on Belmont. I read it because I remember like one of the things he talks about is like you have to have like your writer's room and you go there like every single day at the same time so that your muse knows when and where you're going to be. And if it's okay if you only write one sentence or, a whole book in a day, like you just go in that one time or whatever. And I tried doing that and it just never worked for me. And I love Stephen King and I think he, obviously he's a ridiculously prolific writer. So what worked for him, it works for him very, very well. Um, I don't know if he has ADD or ADHD or if if I have that or what. It just never quite worked. But I've basically been giving myself this excuse for years of, well, I don't think I have the attention span for it anymore, or blah blah blah. I can't read anymore either, and yada yada. And I really just think it's about connecting with a muse. And so I remember, like, you and I have all these conversations over the years of different, when we're going through different existential crises or whatever. And I think one time I was talking to you and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing and blah blah. And you were just like, you're a fucking artist. Anything that you do, like, you're just, it doesn't matter what your medium is. It changes over the years, blah blah blah. You're just doing it. And I really feel like that was like kind of like, oh yeah, you're right. Thanks, Lisa. you know. In terms of the book, like there's just this moment right now where, I sat down to try to work on it and I was having trouble and I was having trouble. And then I don't know what it was, but like last week I just sat down and I fucking busted ass and had like an amazing writing session. And I was like, oh my God, I forgot, like this is what it feels like.
Mm.
Um, and so I think in part, it's like for me, there's like a mindset of giving over myself to a particular muse, if that's the word I want to use, or a particular, it's just like a different hat or something, like writing has a specific hat and I forgot where I put it. and I'm just like, oh yeah, this is where it is, and this is how I put it on, and now I can sit here and write or whatever,
Yeah.
Versus like being an orator, which is also a very different thing, or like filmmaking or photography. Like there's just all of these different sort of, even like social media or something is like a different
It's a
thing.
different muscle. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's been really fun to kind of come back to that, especially with 15, 16 years since writing Rewild or Die. And I don't know if you might know this, but I I rejected college, right? So I never went to college. And over the summer, I was like, you know what? There's like fucking free money in like a FAFSA for me. Like I could actually take some classes for free and like hone my writing skills if I did like, because I never learned how to do citations, even just basics college citations,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I was like, I'm gonna take a writing 121 class and
Sounds
see,
tough.
you know,
How'd that go?
at almost 40 years old,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I did like a Zoom writing 121 class with the community, just the local community college. So I did tell you about this a little bit. Um, and it was just funny because I just like got the top score in the class, and I'm like,
Wow, I didn't know that.
yeah, they were all like, I was actually tutoring two other students who are like English as a second language, who like reached out to me independently of the class. We're like, hey,
Cool,
can you
man.
read this paper
That's
for me?
great.
And so it's just funny to like go back to school in a sense, but also to just um, to flourish with the limitations that were given to me with the assignments, um, and realize, okay, this is uh, I mean, it makes me think of the last time I was writing a paper for college was I was 19, and it was we had to write a review, a book report for this book called The Patriot Chiefs, which was like had different Native American leaders in it, and we had to write a compare and contrast review of two different one of them, and it had to be like 2 or 3 pages long. And I remember it being like a challenge to write 2 or 3 pages on that subject.
Yeah.
And 20 years later, just being able to my teacher was like, you actually need to write less.
Yeah. Because I have to grade all this.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. You're saying it was difficult to summon 2 or 3 pages, like to produce that much
Back in the day.
Yeah.
Right. And now it's just an endless stream.
Well, the thing about constraint, I'm actually very interested in this, and I use it all the time, and I certainly teach with it, is it's like just as a game isn't fun if there aren't rules, to sit down and face the blank page, the reason everybody's so intimidated by that is because there's no container.
Totally.
You're pouring your water on the ground. Like, make a container.
Yeah.
So that you can sort of feel into the volume they're in, and whatever. I could probably extend the metaphor way beyond what it deserves, but that sort of tension between freedom and constraint, I think, is the engine of the universe.
Totally.
Frankly.
Yeah. No, I think so too. And it's actually in part what I'm writing about a little bit right now, because the first chapter is what is rewilding, and I'm really talking about wildness. And people often think of wildness as like no boundaries, or wild and crazy, and you can do whatever you want, and survival of the fit, you can just dominate and take. And at the same, so it's I'm talking about how it's boundless but also bound together by the reactions from all of the different things. Like the container is both you are a part of the container of an ecosystem or whatever. Anyway, I'm
no, I get it. It's the dance of call and response.
Yeah, exactly.
It's self-limiting.
Exactly.
And constantly evolving.
Yes.
It's both and.
Yes.
I mean, really, the Spolin stuff, I'm always talking about Viola Spolin for this, but I just think that those games, it's like when people talk about improv, and they like when lay people think about improv, they think of comedy, which is the root is not, it's not any particular, it's supposed to, those games, their original iteration, they were designed to help foster relationships amongst immigrant kids who didn't speak each other's languages on the south side of Chicago. That's where they come from. They come from Neva Boyd and Viola Spolin. And then Viola Spolin's son, Paul Sills, started Second City. But even they, in their work with actors, it was about like creating a container that could hold the whole of human experience, the fullness of our emotional life, not just comedy. Anyway, not that I have anything against
Sure.
improvisational comedy, but it's a different, it's not the whole story. So, but her genius, it just seems to apply to everything. I really recommend that you read the introduction to that seminal text, Improvisational for the Theater, because she talks about how you use these games in order to free yourself from your own self-consciousness, essentially, because we're taught to the substitute for love for most of us, and the predominant mode of establishing one's position in the world is approval and disapproval, and that destroys everything. I mean destroys the human spirit. It destroys your ability to fully inhabit your life and to fully inhabit your body, to relate with others. I've heard psychoanalysts talk about destroying the superego as sort of, I mean, to me, it feels like an adjunct of that, like whatever it is that puts you in your head so that you're unable to actually listen. That part of you that's planning what you're going to say next, the part of you that's like half listening, but also like, do I have something in my teeth? Do I look cute? Should I pout my mouth? Like all that stuff. Do they like me? Do they approve of me? Because we have finite energy, and these things will suck you dry. And then, of course, you're going to collapse on the couch and binge watch Netflix because there's no more water in the well. And so the idea is that you get your hands involved in a game, and they can stop, tisking or worrying. Anyhow.
Yeah, awesome.
You're sort of fuzzing out, Peter.
Fuzzing out, like audio, or?
Yeah, I got some fuzzy audio.
Yeah, I heard a little static on there too.
Don't spit your static at me. Do I have other questions for you? I guess I wonder, how do you sort of view yourself now? I think when we were kids, you've been revisiting this old Myth Media stuff, which has been delightful. But it reminds me that at that stage of life, which is totally appropriate to young people, I think, we had very sort of inflated notions of how we were going to change the world, and I don't know, maybe you have, but how do you sort of view yourself in the ecology of the massive period of transformation that we're in?
Well, it's funny that you ask, because I was thinking about this just like before we were talking earlier today. When so there was like that night that my dad kicked me out. Well, technically, I don't know. I packed my bag and I left with Matt, and we ended up at your house. It's like when I ran away from home, right?
Yeah.
And at that time, like the argument that set off,
which, by the way, we're 15, right?
Yeah. I'm 15, 16. I think Matt was 15. We were 16. The argument that I got in with my dad that night was that I wanted to go live in the wilderness like a hunter-gatherer and have a tribe, and I thought that's what we were going to do, And then we're like runaways, I was a runaway. I don't know what Matt was. And you were just able to pass wherever you wanted without,
shout out to Kim Anderson.
Yeah. But there was this one day, I don't know if you remember this, you had us do like a meditation called like the 4 Doors or something like this.
Oh, yeah. We used to do that at slumber parties as well.
Yeah. We were basically a slumber party, right? I think it might've been at Brandon's house actually, in the basement or something. But, so we were lying there, and you had us do this thing where one door was like the doorway to your future, like when you're going to open it and you're going to walk through, and you're going to be 10 years from now, or maybe 15, 20 years from now or something, right? You're going to walk through, and that's going to be your future. And I, even like, I'm such a fucking skeptic at this day and age in my life that it's hard for me to believe anything,
Yeah.
But back then I was so much more open to things, right? Which is why this makes this so fucking real. is that I walked through that door and it was a fucking office with a computer screen and like a library of books, like this tiny little cramped little office. And I remember like coming out of the meditation being like, that was fucking bullshit. Like, I don't know why that is the image that came into my mind. We're gonna be hunter gatherers, like living out in the forest in 20 years. Civilization is gonna be gone in 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And I was just sitting in the Rewild office the other day, and I was sitting there and I looked around. I'm in this like cramped little office with bookshelves and this fucking monitor that I barely ever use because I'm on my laptop for the most part. And I was just like, holy fucking shit.
Yeah,
This
here I
is the
am.
fucking room.
Wow.
So I mean, as much as we were like what we thought we were going to do versus what like on
So Peter,
some
can I ask you, would you say that you killed your dream to live your vision?
no.
For those who don't know, that was one of the catchphrases of the school we went to. But that was kind of a nice one. It's sort of true. You know, there's like there's the fantasy and then there's where you're most useful.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, there are people who have gone on to do the things I thought I wanted to do, you know? I mean, that's the thing. There are people who are doing that kind of shit. But I think you and I both it just wasn't our bag fully, you know,
Yeah.
like it never was. Um, and that's a good thing because we are where we need to be and we're doing the things that we should be doing. Um, and so in that sense, I think that it's you know, it's funny because I so vividly remember that like meditation because I was so annoyed and was like, what? That's not going to be it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is. And that's awesome because, you know, there's like what is actually going to happen. And I don't think it's idealism per se, because I really hate it when people use the word idealistic, even though it's in a sense totally true. I don't know. Yeah. I feel like
Yeah.
we've done a lot more than most in that sense, you know.
Future feels a little foggy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. We should do another one of those four-door meditations.
I know. I was just thinking. I have no sense. It really
know.
feels completely up for grabs.
Yeah.
I've really no sense of what is
Yeah.
going on. I mean, I think most people feel that way.
Totally.
But even I, you know, and I'm hearing you say yes to this too. It makes sense to me that if your expectation is that the world will go on as it always has, that, and you prepare for a career and you live in a city and whatever, that this tumultuous couple of years would be sort of a shock to the system, you know. What's surprising to me is how unprepared I have been, you know. Yeah, like I've been for more than half my life, I've been sort of anticipating major reorganizations, let's say.
Totally.
Socio-political, economic, ecological, whatever.
Yeah.
And yet I've never felt so uncertain about what lay in store. I think part of it is I sort of joked about this in another interview, but it's true that a lot of our fantasies, the original envisioning of this alternate future would be that we'd be living in the woods, you know. The woods are burning. So there is no, you know, the farthest reaches of the wilderness and all the whole Tom Brown mythos. It doesn't apply.
No.
And I guess what I want to say about not knowing and feeling so vulnerable now that I have a child to be in this space of really not knowing is that I also feel relieved almost that there's like you really can't anticipate anything because it forces a kind of presence.
Exactly.
Like I'm on this level with everybody else on the planet right now, like just waiting and seeing, you know. And I guess there's something a little bit thrilling just in the way of, you know, change. Just, you know, when what has been so entrenched is disrupted, even if it's frightening, it's also, there's more creative possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, like, I mean, and here, the thing about both of us is that we just like, I mean, this is how I think of you and me, is that we just like unquestioningly follow our hearts to do the fucking thing we need to do. And so if we were to have, um, you know, chosen fear, which I think in a large part is what we initially did, um, forcing ourselves to be in situations that we thought we had to be in because
Yeah.
civilization is going to collapse. I have to learn this, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever. Um, and then it's cool to hear you say that because I think about how bullshit it is that anybody thinks that they can prepare for what's coming in any particular way other than to just live in the moment, moment to
Yeah.
moment, and how random it'll actually be. And, recently this was a wake up call for me when you said everything's burning, the forests are burning. I spent 20 years mapping the Malala River corridor. And in September of last year, it fucking burned to a crisp. And I haven't been able to even go in. They built a gate to prevent entry. So the land that I've been getting to know for like 20 years that was like, this is where I'm going to go when the apocalypse happens. The apocalypse happened there first.
Yeah.
What do you do now, Peter? Like, and then of
Well, I
course,
mean,
the apocalypse is sort of a, hyperbole.
it's sort of a laughing matter, but I kind of want to slow it down because what you're saying is really important, and I think it's new. I mean, maybe it wasn't new to other people, but I think it's new to us, and it's new to the conversations that I've been having about this hypothetical future
Mhm.
for so long. Um, that's something you just said. That one of the arguments I make in Believers is that the way you have a marriage is by showing up day in and day out to the same person in all kinds of, or to the same ecosystem in all kinds of weather, for richer, for poorer, come rain, sun, or snow,
Yeah.
come toxic effluents from upstream, that kind of
Yeah.
devotional practice. And you can do that for 20 years and it can still burn down.
Yeah.
And then who are you?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So I think it's not, to me, it's not even I mean, of course it's something to be grieved, but I think what I'm trying to get at is, um, and what I get at in the end of the book is that this, how then shall we live? That question isn't what is the right way to live. The question is knowing that death is your companion, that is who you're always walking with, and that we can extrapolate that sort of reality from our own mortality to like our ideas, to our vision of the future, to whatever control we thought we had
Yeah.
over the outcome. um, that sort of prepares you not only to be present and awake in your life, but also to be ultimately flexible. And I think, um, to walk with the fire of your own mortality in
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
and to really be in service. I mean, we often talk about serving future generations, but to really like hold in your mind or in your body or your heart or whatever, that vision of life coming and coming,
Yeah.
uh, I don't know. To me
Yeah. I
right
mean,
now, it feels liberatory.
yeah. Yeah, it was, and then I actually did revisit I went, I snuck in to see what was going on, with the land, um, and to see it coming back was, you know, uh, both sad and awesome to know that, even though the whole thing burned down in a sense, that yeah, it just keeps coming. And
What
then
did you see coming back?
big leaf maples that were so big around that I couldn't put my fingers together, a trunk, but burned to a crisp at the top, coming back to life from the roots.
Mm.
All of the ferns were coming back, all of the salmonberry, all of the Oregon grape, all of the things were coming back, from their roots. That's not to say that that was happening everywhere, right? But fire on the land, fire is, those forests are meant to have fire, right? That's a whole other part of this thing too, right?
Yep.
That level of fire is actually more than it needed probably, but that maintenance of fire is a part of that. And so understanding the cycles of disturbance and regeneration, not just on the landscape, but like in ourselves in that regard,
Yeah.
But being able to hold that, and that's, I think, actually the quote unquote like survival skill, or just like existence skill, is being able to follow your heart and just stay on that course instead of trying to suspend or arrest the development of any particular aspect of that cycle of regeneration and disturbance,
Yeah. Well, it sounds, I mean, it's in danger of sounding twee or something, but I think really that idea of letting yourself burn and then seeing what's left.
Yeah.
Of course it's not literal, but
right.
but it's very close to what it feels like,
Totally.
So listen, Peter, I hear the baby's awake.
Okay. Yeah.
And I should probably go tend him.
Awesome.
I'm really glad that you made space for this. I hope that we weren't too, often we're like siblings. So sometimes we can talk without actually
giving
describing the content.
It's fine.
Like,
Yeah. Totally.
It was my honor though.
Yeah, mine as well. And give Jude a kiss for me.
I will. All right. Well, let's talk again soon.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay. Love you.
Okay. Love you too. Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with author Lisa Wells. If you haven't picked it up yet, you can grab a copy of her book, Believers: Making a Life at the End of the World. You can also check out her website at www.lisawellswriter.com. And as always, if this podcast has inspired you, please become a patron of the Rewilding Podcast at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thank you.